Hello everyone, welcome back. As you can see, I've got a Steam Deck here. Mine came in the mail, and of course I paid for this with my own money. Ooh, it's starting to turn on. All I did was just plug in the power cord. According to the almighty warning huge decal thing, it says that you gotta plug it in first, and then you could turn it on. I did not press the power button, I just went ahead and plugged it in, and so it seems that after you do that, then it starts to wake up and do its thing. But yeah, first impressions, I think that this is really cool. The buttons feel really good. The Steam button, and then this 3-dot, I'm guessing an options button right there, they're not really all that great. I thought that they would be more clicky, and they're not. They're just kind of spongy, like it's directly on the board. The rest of the buttons are fine. D-pad is awesome. The face buttons, they have a good feel to them. As you can see, I have not even set this thing up. I have not tried any games on it or anything. But I am going to go ahead and put this thing through its paces. Probably not spec-wise as far as benchmarks or anything. I think there's 1,000 channels that you could get that from. Instead, I'm going to put this against some other devices I have, some devices that you've seen on this channel, and sort of take a look at it through a usability perspective. And is this really an improvement? Is this really a step up from what we've had before? I see this as just something that, like the old GPD that I had, it sort of changes the way you play your Steam library. But let's go ahead and get into it. I've got to test this out. Excuse me. And I've got to get over this cough, but hopefully this thing will help me out to stay indoors, be comfortable, and get to my backlog.
Alright, I've been playing the Steam Deck for about a month now, and boy do we have a lot to talk about. Let's go back to the controls now that I've been using them for a while. Even though they're spread wide apart, I found it really easy to adjust to them. Once the devices see it in your hands, the controls are great, provided that you don't have to make any awkward movements. Because the Steam Deck is a little heavier than you might imagine, so awkward movements make it slip in your grip. Like for example, the start and select buttons are placed a little too high for my liking, and so when I adjust my grip to reach them, the weight shifts and then I have to get settled again. But those are rarely used in gameplay, so it's not a problem that comes up too often. And yes, I know, I'm being ultra nitpicky. I mentioned in the unboxing that the Steam and I don't know what that is, the ellipsis button, they feel kind of squishy. And that's probably by design. The buttons are flush with the unit. I'm sure it's like that so that they're not pressed by mistake. But they do feel weird and it's hard to tell if you're putting enough pressure on them. I think it would have been a better choice to just have them sit on standard micro switches. The shoulder buttons still don't feel right to me. They feel more akin to an Xbox One shoulder buttons rather than a PS4, but they just don't feel as polished as either of them. It's hard to describe. The triggers work well, they have a lot of travel. The back buttons I'm not such a big fan of. I don't think they're a good idea to use on any handheld. They're awkward to press because they face outwards more than they do inwards. They require more pressure than the face buttons. And like anything that feels awkward on this, doing that upsets the weight balance and makes the device, and therefore the screen, move in your hands more than I like. But I hardly use those buttons. When I do, it's mostly for mapping keyboard inputs. The touchpads are fantastic. They feel much better than those on the Steam controllers. And like I said when I first saw this thing, making them squared was a stroke of genius. I actually wish I could find more uses for them. It felt like most of the control options chose to avoid the touchpads and focus only on an Xbox button layout, which I guess is to be expected. But on games that support them like a mouse, I was usually able to make the more delicate moves you would need with a mouse, even if it took just a little bit longer. Compared to the Steam controller, the controls here are starkly different. The shoulder buttons feel nicer, they have a better click to them like a mouse, and the triggers have this little blip at the end of their travel. The analog stick is convex, whereas the Steam Deck's is slightly concave, and I hate that they didn't carry that forward. I always liked it, and it sucks that no one else is making their analog sticks like that. But the trackpads are much better on the deck. Like I said, huge improvement there. The Steam Deck is well put together, but it just doesn't feel like a premium product to me. The Steam controller feels like it had more care and attention to detail put into it. You could tell it went through dozens of iterations. I was hoping the Steam Deck would continue that progress. It was a radical design. You could tell they were trying to redefine what a controller could be. But the Steam Deck doesn't have that unique feel. It's like they're using discounted off-the-shelf parts for the controls. I guess that has its advantages. They went with what works, but I just wish they had taken what they learned from the Steam controller and carried that forward. Let's compare it to a few other devices. We have the WikiPad, and yes, I still have this thing laying around. This is an Android handheld that turns into a tablet. It's about the same size as the Steam Deck, but much lighter. The grips are beefier, which feels great in your hands, but for the sake of portability, I do prefer the Steam Deck, which is a little slimmer. Both of them are large, so much so that I don't know if I want to bring this on a trip. I guess it would be nice to have it if you're stuck in a hotel, but I can't imagine pulling out something with this kind of a footprint if I'm sitting in an airplane seat. I did take the WikiPad on a trip back when I reviewed it, so I know its size is a burden, and the Steam Deck doesn't have any real advantage there either. Next, the GPD Win 1. This comparison really made me appreciate how small the Win is. The controls are worse on the Win. It was their first gaming handheld, but it still has a major advantage with that 3-position switch. That's basically like plugging in a USB controller or a mouse at an instant. I wish the deck had a physical button or a switch like that. On the deck, you can switch the controls digitally on the fly, but it doesn't work as well as it did on the Win. I'm not going to compare the in-game performance of these two against the deck. That's sort of impossible, because the WikiPad runs an ancient form of Android, the Win uses Windows, and in case you didn't know, the deck runs a customized fork of Arch Linux. Let's talk about battery life. I've heard some horrible stories about battery life on this thing. One site said that they drained it in under 90 minutes. I never saw it get that bad. I was mostly playing indie games. Like I said before, this is mostly a backlog machine for me. But while I was playing House of the Dying Sun, I did notice it was getting pretty warm and the fans were getting all angry at me. So I decided to test it with that. I started with a full battery. I played it until it went down to 48%, and that took 1 hour and 25 minutes. I know it's super unscientific, but I would say if you're really pushing it, you can expect to get about 2.5 hours of battery life. Of course, it all depends on the games that you're running. For a lot of the simpler games I was playing, they barely put a dent in the battery life. I'm satisfied with the battery. I think they did well. Now let's get into compatibility. Let me start by saying that this is a totally vanilla test. I'm not going to be sideloading or modding or doing anything like that. I'm just going to review this now as like a regular consumer that bought this off the shelf. I have over 800 games in my Steam library, and I tested 108 while playing on the deck. I'll scroll through those right now. If I don't mention having a problem with one of these titles, then you can be pretty sure that it worked with no issue when I tried to run it. I'm going to be pointing out the ones that didn't work. At this point, I should tell you that there are green checkmark games that signify that they run, quote, great on deck. They have their own category when you look at your library on the deck, which is nice. Obviously, I'm not limiting myself to just the green checkmark games. That would be ridiculous. Yes, I know there are thousands upon thousands of games in the Steam ecosystem, but this device was designed for that ecosystem. So I'm expecting a broad range of games to work, not just the ones it likes. And I hope you could see that the games I selected are well within the performance range of what the Steam Deck should be able to run. I didn't choose them because I wanted to be like, aha, you bastard, it didn't work. These are mostly just games that I really like or wanted to see how they would look on a handheld. The first game I tried was Antechamber. I tried to play it and it doesn't work. First impressions are everything, and that's not a good look. The very first game I tried and I already have a problem. And it's not that the game doesn't load. The game's logo is saying over some sort of an agreement screen, no button or mouse click gets you around it. But then a friend suggested that I try pressing Alt and Enter to go into full screen mode, so I mapped 2 of the back buttons to that, and that solved it. I didn't even have to check OK. The problem just went away and never came back. So you could already see there's a lot of workarounds you need to learn to get the most out of this device, and that's not a good thing. But before I get into more incompatible games, let me just tell you about some games that work really well and impressed me. I was impressed by Claybook, which is one of the most demanding indie games out there. It does heat up the deck quite a bit, but I was amazed to see that it works just fine. Another game was Maximum Override. This is an indie game that's not very well known. It's an open world destruction simulator. It's very obviously inspired by Stephen King's Maximum Overdrive, and it requires some serious power to run correctly. The game is horribly unoptimized, but because of that, I like using it to determine how good a device is. And so I was impressed that the Steam Deck was able to handle this. But when I really pushed it hard, I was able to crash the game. But again, that's when I was actively trying to make that happen. Size Matters is another cool indie game, and it really shows off how good the trackpads are. There's this little keypad that you have to use at one point, and it is so easy to do it with a trackpad. Those are just a handful of games I could think of that impressed me. But now let's look at the games that disappointed. First, we have Bionic Commando Rearmed. It doesn't work. It says it needs some sort of a tool the Steam Deck doesn't have. Camera Obscura. This one's interesting. It plays the first level just fine, and then it doesn't work. Once you make it to the end of the first level, it goes to a swirling Steam logo, and it never comes back. This is a very common problem. If a game does this at the start for more than 5 seconds, you could be pretty sure that it's not going to work at all. Or if it switches to this during gameplay, you could tell it's over, the game is crashing. This goddamn thing haunts my dreams. I call it the steamy swirl of death, because it reminds me of something swirly, and steamy, and shitty. Dark Void Zero has this horrible DRM thing that pops up when you try to run it. This will happen when you run it on a desktop PC as well, but on there it's just this very convenient copy and paste command. On the Steam Deck, you have to input the key one by one. At least it only asks for it once, and the game will work. But this is just one example of something that's easy to do on a desktop that becomes harder or impossible on the deck. Deadbolt. It works, but the controls are awful. I tried all the layouts, including the recommended settings, and it doesn't help. Even when I use the trackpad as a mouse, I can't get it to move fast enough for the game. The next Penelope. This is one of my favorite indie box games, and it doesn't work. Spin Tires. It works, but the controls are frozen at the start screen. I was able to get the mouse to work, but the game still won't recognize the buttons. Sniper Elite V2 doesn't work. However, 3 does work, and works really well. I don't own 4 or 5, sorry I can't test those. I'm behind on my Sniper Elites. Warshift. It works, but the controls make it unplayable. Even when I go to the options and select controller, it doesn't make a difference. I tried all the layouts, including the recommended settings, and it doesn't help. This game really wants you to use a keyboard and mouse with a scroll wheel, and that's not fit for the Steam Deck. Tiny and Big, one of my favorite indie games of all time. It does work, but the controls are frozen at the title screen. But there is a workaround to this. Go into Properties, select this Force Compatibility option. It triggers some sort of an update. I don't know what this option does, but now the controls are unstuck and the game works fine. I will say though, this option rarely works in other games. I tried it with all the other incompatible games and it didn't help. Just like on Hammer Fight, the game boots up but the controls are frozen. This is a game that's meant to be played with a mouse, so I wanted to see if I could get it to work with the touchpads, but no matter which control scheme I chose, it won't recognize any of them. It does recognize the touchscreen, but it won't use that as a mouse, so the game is unplayable here. Mr. Shifty. This is another favorite of mine which sadly does not work. It gives the steamy swirl of death, a blue screen, and nothing else. TIS 100. This one has a weird problem. The game runs just fine, I bet you can even finish it, but if you press the Steam button, it causes the game to crash. That's the only game where I saw that happen, but the news here is that it can happen. So the game does work, it just has a weird crash that makes the Steam button act as an exit button. Receiver. This game does work, but it's just not made for controllers. Even with the recommended settings and trying other people's configurations, I couldn't get it to work. If I really wanted to run this game, I would probably have to see all the keyboard inputs and map each one individually in the Steam Deck settings, but by that point, I'd rather just play this on a desktop. Alright, now those were all games that don't have a green check mark. None of those were guaranteed to work. For the green checkmark games, from what I could tell in my testing, for the most part they work really well. But even then, I still ran into problems. In LEGO Jurassic World, there's a weird green line at the top and I couldn't get that to go away. Pony Island works just fine, but I just thought it's weird they gave this game a green checkmark status, when the beginning of the game gives you an explicit warning telling you do not play it with a touchpad. But it worked for me, I was able to make some progress, so there you go. Gun Scoring Cannoli 2 consistently crashes at the end of every level. But it does save your progress. When you restart the game, it continues on the next level like the crash never happened. So I guess they were like, yeah, sure, that's good enough. Green checkmark. Weirdly enough though, the first Guns Gorin' Cannoli game does work, and it does not have that end of level bug, but it's marked as being incompatible with the Steam Deck. So did they give the green checkmark to the wrong game? I don't know. And lastly, Redout. Oh, Redout. The redheaded stepchild of my Steam Deck. This game is a perfect example of how bad things can get on the Steam Deck. I downloaded it and it didn't want to work. I thought, that's weird. A green checkmark game that won't work at all? So sometime later I decided to delete and re-download it and see if that changes anything. Maybe a file got corrupted or something. So I'm laying in bed, I re-download the game, run it again, and it works! So I'm like, alright, it looks good, let me go record this. I get in front of the camera and now it doesn't work again. So I'm like, damn it, you guys are never gonna believe me. This thing is so inconsistent sometimes. So I reset the device, try again, and it still doesn't work. And because the definition of insanity is trying the same thing twice and expecting different results, of course I try again. And guess what? Now it works! Why it didn't work those other times, I have no freaking clue. I didn't mess with any of the other settings, it just wouldn't work. So then later I was recording footage through the USB-C port. Everything's going well, so I decided to record some Redout footage. And what do you think happened? It doesn't fucking work, of course. I have no idea why this game is giving me such problems. It works only when it wants to. I don't get disappointed with technology that often, but when this happened, I wanted to throw this fucking thing out the window. That green check mark needs to be revoked. And I'm sure there's going to be someone in the comments saying, "You don't get it. This is a revolutionary device. It's breaking down the walled gardens. You need to be easier on it." Bullshit. If this same thing was happening on the Switch port, I would have to scrape you off the ceiling. This is unacceptable. And I'm not being a Nintendo fanboy when I say that. I don't own a Switch, I don't want a Switch. I'm just telling you the facts that green checkmark is essentially Valve's seal of quality. And these types of issues would not be tolerated if the shoe was on the other foot. So why do we tolerate it here? The same goes for that Gunsgoring Cannoli 2 bug, which also happens to be a game ported to the Switch as well. And I tried hard to give these games a fair chance on this device. For Tiny and Big, any other reviewer would have just called that an incompatible game and moved on. And there's other problems I encountered that had more to do with the system as a whole. As you could see when I tried to get Redout to work, I restarted the device. I wasn't able to catch it on camera, but there are times when it just won't load anything and you have to restart the whole thing to get it to work again. Hold up, I have an update. I was filming something else, and joy of joys, I was able to catch this bug on camera. I'm gonna fast forward, but as you could see, it's refusing to play any of the games I select. And these are easy games that it's played before, and some that you've even seen working on this. But it just gives a steamy swirl of death, and that's it. It will come back, but only after I restart the device. But here's a tip for you. When you update the deck, it has to restart anyway. So if you find yourself experiencing this issue, just tell it to check for an update anyway and save yourself a trip. I've also had a problem where very few games carry over their save states from my desktop. Usually when I move from one PC to another, Steam will just carry over my progress. But here, 9 times out of 10, I have to start a new save. Heat is another problem. This thing gets really hot, but it's not a problem in the way that you would imagine. It's actually pretty manageable. The device got warm, but not to an alarming degree. The fan is noticeable, but I wouldn't call it loud. And when I'm playing a game, it just becomes white noise. It didn't bother me like I thought it would. What does bother me though is the SD card slot. If you're downloading a large game, it gets extremely hot. Hot enough that you wouldn't want to leave your finger there for too long. And for God's sake, do not leave it plugged in while downloading a large game, because it only gets hotter. I'm not concerned with it burning my skin, but what worries me is the lifespan of the SD card when it's exposed to that kind of heat. And other people have reported to me that they're having the same issue, it's not just me. Who the fuck designed this thing? Krusty the Clown? However, by far the biggest problem I have with this device right now is broken downloads. It was so hard to make a list of games that were incompatible with this because sometimes the game itself does work, my device just didn't download it correctly. So when I try to play it and get the steamy swirl of death, I assume it's incompatible. Then I download it a second time and it's working just fine. Here's what's causing the problem as I understand it. When you go into your library and select a game to install, it begins to download it. And if you select another game to install, that one gets priority and stops the last download, and so on and so forth. I'm pretty sure pausing and resuming these downloads is causing file corruption, and I don't see any way to get around it unless you download one game at a time. The last step in installing is supposed to be verifying the game data, but obviously that's not working because this is happening all the time. Why can't there be a download queue that works? I don't get how a big company like Valve could not notice something like this. So, as you can see, using the Steam Deck can be very frustrating. But remember, I'm highlighting the issues I had with it. What you're not seeing is the fun I've been having. I played House of the Dying Sun from start to finish on the deck, and it was one of the most amazing gaming experiences I've had all year. It has a lot of issues, but overall I have to admit that I've been enjoying my time with the Steam Deck. Using the deck feels a lot like playing on an emulator. A bad emulator. You know, like N64 or PS2. Some games I like don't work on those either, but when something isn't compatible, that doesn't mean that I stop using the emulator altogether. I just move on and play something it can handle. That's how it feels using the Steam Deck. It has incompatibilities, but there's a lot of good games that do work on it. Yes, a tear rolled down my cheek when I tried to play Mr. Shifty and got the steamy swirl of death instead. But then I just play a different game that does work, and as long as I'm playing something I like, I'm a happy camper. I'm glad I own this. Do not think I railed against the Smash Z and PGS projects because I think handheld PCs are the work of Satan. I called out those projects because I want to see more products like this, but I don't think people need to be scammed for us to get there. A lot of people have been asking me for my thoughts on the deck because of my coverage of the Smash Z. That comparison is hard because for one, the Smash Z was a scam, they never delivered to their backers. So how can you really compare the two? One exists on the market and the other one doesn't. The Smash backers were the early worm that got the bird, unfortunately. And I still think it's crazy the Smash project fed their backers lie after lie for so many years and the backers just ate it up. They supported those shitheads all those years and got nothing to show for it. And then Valve shows up, announces their own device, and less than a year later, I'm already reviewing mine. That's insane. But there is one similarity between the two that I'd like to touch on. The Smash Z was supposed to run a version of Arch Linux, which is what the deck is running right now. Of course they're not identical. You can tell Valve put a ton of work into their user interface. It's actually really slick when it's running correctly. But it's just so buggy that it makes me think it might not be the best choice for an operating system. It really feels like we're beta testing this device for them. Valve has a weird hard-on for Linux, and every time they try to build a system around it, it runs like garbage. But if Valve, a multi-billion-dollar company, is having these issues, I can only imagine how bad the Smash Z would have been. And that makes me sad because I feel like we got robbed of some good comedic potential there. Now, I wanted to do this review using just the factory operating system, but after this, I'm definitely going to sideload Windows and EmuDeck to see how those run as well. And I do appreciate that Valve is keeping the door open so we could try out such a thing. It is very hard for me to recommend this device. If you're going to run a broad range of games, then be prepared to have your patience tested regularly. Let me give you another illustration of what the Steam Deck is like because not everyone uses emulators. Imagine you're on a European road trip. You're driving through what looks like a fairy tale. You're seeing some of the most beautiful sights in the world. But here's the catch. The road is littered with potholes. You can barely concentrate on any of the scenery before getting jolted out of it. For some people, that ruins the whole experience. They would rather not even go. For others, they can just tune out those potholes and enjoy the rest. That's what owning the Steam Deck is like. It's so buttery smooth and beautiful until it isn't. Then it gets aggravating real quick. When it comes to technology, I think I have a higher pain tolerance than most. I mean, look at all the other junk I have fun with. But I don't know what your limit is, and that's what I want you to be aware of. This device is good enough for me, but I don't know if it's good enough for you. And that's all I got for today. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next time.